in all of Scotland, so I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon to talk to you about our Local Government Overview 2022 report. So as the Deputy Chair of the Commission mentioned in his opening remarks, the Local Government Overview is quite a high profile output for the Commission, and it gives us the opportunity to set out the current state of local government in Scotland, as well as look ahead to the challenges and risks that the local government bodies face over the next year and beyond. So today's presentation is going to focus on the key findings and recommendations arising from our work in preparing the 2022 overview. So by way of an introduction to the report, it published in May of this year, and it is actually the second in a series of reports covering Council's journey through the various phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this series of reports kicked off last year with a look at Council's initial response activity, and it included a number of good practice case study examples to highlight the really impressive work that was carried out by councils in such demanding circumstances. The case studies were identified with assistance from our colleagues in the Improvement Service, and it gave us a chance to shine a light on some of the really positive developments that we saw with a view to encouraging the sharing of this learning and experience across the country. So our 2022 report builds on those findings and messages and assesses Council's response to the second year of the pandemic, with particular focus on progress towards recovery and renewal. So anecdotally, we had heard that year 2 of the pandemic was actually more difficult than year 1, just in terms of being more challenging around the level of public expectation as things were perceived to go back to normal, and with that the level of tolerance of the public somewhat diminished. Therefore, the effects of COVID were still being sharply felt by councils at that point. Therefore, meeting those demands were really difficult. Sorry, I can see some messages coming in about the presentation. Wait, I'll try and share it differently. Hopefully that works better. So, come back to where I was on the introduction slide. Our report considers the challenges that councils face alongside the many others, and we make recommendations for elected members and senior officers within the report. In addition to this, we prepared and published a questions for elected members checklist as a supplement to the report, and we hope that this will be a useful strategic tool for all members, both returning and newly elected, and leading their council through the next phase of the pandemic. So the key messages and themes arising from the 2022 report can be split broadly across 7 main areas. I'll list them here just now and then go on to talk in a bit more detail thereafter. So as the slide sets out, we identified 7 main key themes. These are difficult and uncertain context, leadership, workforce, funding, service disruption and inequalities, community involvement, and data. So if we look at key theme number 1, difficult and uncertain environment, in what is perhaps quite a big understatement, the last year was difficult for local government. As I mentioned previously, the impacts and effects of COVID didn't go away, and in some cases it actually intensified. So it made it really challenging for councils to respond, as well as recover services that had been paused or stopped, address associated backlogs across services, and also plan for renewal against a backdrop of increasing complexity and uncertainty. This complexity and uncertainty includes factors such as policy and reform decisions, including the development of a national care service, and the uncertainty that this brings around the future sustainability of councils. Councils also face demographic pressures through an ageing population, increasing inequalities and rising poverty, and also increasing costs through higher than we've seen in a number of years inflation and the knock-on impact in terms of cost of living. Councils are feeling these challenges pretty sharply as well. So theme number 2 is leadership, and that is one, of course, that is very relevant for today's session. So within the report, when we mention leaders, we mean elected members, chief executives and senior management teams. So we've stressed the importance of strong collaborative leadership and effective working relationships between elected members and senior officers. This is with a view to those partnerships setting the tone for the organisation and building on the positive progress over the past 2 years. So we've seen some strong examples of agile and joint working throughout the pandemic, bringing together councils and local partners, communities and citizens. It's also important that leaders with the right skills are in place to make good decisions and think strategically for the organisation. This will be crucial to learning lessons from the pandemic. Further risks and challenges related to the leadership team include turnover in senior officers and also changes in political leadership. As with any change, there's a risk that the momentum that's been built beforehand will be lost, and it's therefore important that leaders who remain in post are able to maintain momentum and drive their council forward towards recovery. And finally, and again, relevant to today's session, the local government elections in May of 2022 will likely have a bit of an impact. So with a large number of newly elected members, many of whom we're delighted to see with us today, there'll be a period of learning and adjustment, but it's of critical importance, of course, that the difficult decisions that need to be made are made, and the progress thus far is built upon. So the next of the key themes to highlight is workforce. Firstly, it's important to recognise the resilience of the local government workforce during the pandemic. So they worked incredibly hard to maintain services and embrace new ways of working. However, staff continue to face significant pressures. High demand for services, increasing staff absence levels, and the risk of staff burnout are all continuing to increase workforce pressure. Councils are also experiencing skill shortages in key areas. So on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got Exhibit 7 from the report, which shows social care has been a significant area of concern across most of Scotland's councils. In terms of opportunities amongst the many challenges and risks, hybrid working opens up possibilities for councils to support a more flexible and adaptable workforce of the future. So underpinning all of the challenges faced by councils is their financial position. COVID-19 has had a significant impact, and the longer-term position remains uncertain due to shorter-term funding cycles, increases in ring-fence funding, and potential gaps as COVID-19 funding ends. For elected members and senior officers, it's crucial that the robust medium and longer-term financial plans are in place. The plan should be clearly linked to other key strategic documents, including the Council's overarching recovery strategy. And the development of a fiscal framework should hopefully help in terms of giving councils more financial certainty to plan for the future. Our report also notes spending reductions in key service areas over the longer term. So Exhibit 3 on the right-hand side of the slide is again taken from the report and uses a local government benchmarking framework from 2021. It shows that some smaller and unprotected services have seen significant cuts over the past 10 years. So, for example, libraries, street and parks have seen reductions of over 30% over that period, clearly making things difficult to maintain similar levels of service over that period. So key theme number 5 is service disruption and inequalities. This came through really strongly in the report. The pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities, and service disruptions played a significant part in that. While some services were maintained, the quick pivot to digital provision was really helpful in doing that. Not all services are back to pre-pandemic levels. We've also noted a lack of clarity on the level of demand, unmet need and service backlogs. It's important therefore that councils have this information to make the decisions that are going to help support those most in need. Digital exclusion is also a big risk, especially for those who rely on the likes of library services to access online information. So although digital service delivery has been massively helpful over the past 2 years, it doesn't work for everyone, so councils need to be aware of that and make sure that alternatives are provided so as to minimise the risk of digital exclusion. So linked to that slide, we've got community involvement. So again, this was another key theme from the report and one that we built upon from the 2021 report. Councils work closely with communities and the voluntary sector in the early stages of the pandemic, and we saw some really positive outcomes. It's important, therefore, that they continue to be involved as councils shape the rest of the recovery journey. The slide draws attention to our Community Empowerment COVID-19 update briefing, which highlights some key learning points that will hopefully be helpful for elected members to take into account when help shaping that plan for the future. And finally, on the key themes, we have data. So data has played a hugely important role in guiding and informing the response to the pandemic. But significant data gaps are in place which may hinder and hamper recovery. These data gaps exist around areas such as unmet need, service demands and backlogs and inequalities. We also note that improvements are needed in terms of data availability, the tools that are in place and the skills to analyse to support councils making good strategic decisions and monitoring performance effectively. So To start to summarise on the presentation, we know that there's some key pandemic lessons for which councils can learn. Understanding these and taking them forward as part of recovery plans are going to be essential. It's also important for councils to note that just reverting back to the way that things were before the pandemic is not always the right decision. So it's important to build on the lessons that have been learned so far, and again harness that positivity in future actions. So lessons learned include the importance of collaborative working, better use of data, the use of technology to accelerate service redesign, and embracing new ways of working for staff. So all of the points on this slide will be really helpful for councils in progressing through the next stage of recovery. And finally, moving on to recommendations. So firstly, just to apologise for the slightly smaller text on this slide, but hopefully that's a good thing because it means we've got quite a lot of recommendations to make and will hopefully be helpful for elected members to be aware of. Many of these recommendations, or most of these recommendations, are linked to the key learning points from the previous slide. And what we've tried to do with the recommendations is turn them into measurable actions for councils to take forward. So I'm sure that the slides will be shared. I think David put a comment on the chat to say that will be done, so members can have a look in more detail thereafter. But just to kind of point out some of the key recommendations that we've made, the importance of good strategic planning, the updating of workforce plans, and again the use of data to inform good decision making. So lots to think about there, lots that tie in with the elected member checklist that we've produced, and again, hopefully we'll be able to share that with you, and you can use it to help as a strategic tool going forward. So that's all I'd like to say on the report at the moment. I know we've got some time for a Q&A, so quite happy to pause there and open up to some questions. Thank you.